David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
So last night we had the third Democratic presidential debate. This one with 10 candidates total instead of 10 candidates across two nights happened on just one night. And this was actually, in just about every sense, the best debate so far. And I'll tell you who I think did well. I'll tell you what I think the impact of it will be. But as far as a debate goes, yes, the ABC Univision moderators still asked cartoonishly stupid questions, which I will discuss. But I had sort of complained on Twitter, 3 hours. Do we really need 3 hours of debate, particularly when at most of these 25 minutes go by before the first question is even asked, between sports-like introductions and an immediate commercial break and a video montage and opening statements? You don't get to the first question very often until nearly 30 minutes in. They didn't do that. They started with the first question very, very quickly, or at least opening statements. It ended actually like 20 minutes shy of the 3 hour mark. And in the end, all the other debates had gone long. This one went short and was far more substantive. They spent, I think it was the first 30 to 35 minutes of questions, I'm going from memory here, was just healthcare. Did we learn an insane amount about everybody's healthcare plans? Maybe not. But what did happen, and this is the whole point, when you spend more time on one topic, even when it is 10 people on the stage, which is a whole other problem, even if you don't get that much more detail from most people about their plans, it starts to become clear who has nothing more than just 2 or 3 bullet points about what they would do. Joe Biden starting to stumble about the dynamics of if you can afford it or if you can't afford it or whatever else the case may be. Elizabeth Warren, who had been accused of backing off of Medicare for all, at least in rhetoric during yesterday's debate, coming back fully and saying Medicare for all is the way, very astutely rebutting this idea that taxes would go up by saying very clearly, yeah, but who cares if taxes go up? The total cost goes down because you don't have premiums and copays and all of this other stuff. Let's talk about some of the different elements of this that I think will impact it overall. Let me get out of the way. The moderators did a better job than in many previous debates, and by focusing longer periods of time on one issue, they were playing a role of furthering depth on some topics, including climate change and healthcare, et cetera. But there was still no shortage of completely ridiculous questions. At one point, asking Bernie Sanders to say, hey, you're a socialist and Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela is a socialist. What do you make of that? And then Bernie Sanders having to explain different types of socialism. This actually, I said it on Twitter and some people agreed with me. Some people went after me. Bernie's policy, if Bernie's a democratic socialist privately, okay, maybe he is. Bernie's policies are social democratic policies in line with capitalist countries in Northern Europe that are well regulated and use the fruits of the capitalist system to disproportionately help the least among us. That's Bernie's policy. And this is one of those things where I've been saying it for years at this point, and like 75% of my audience is with me, 25 is not. If he all along just said, I considered myself a democratic socialist in my youth or whatever, or not even mention that, I'm a social democrat. My policies are in line with countries that are capitalist countries. Nicolas Maduro and that form of faux populist so-called socialism, whatever, it has nothing to do with what I'm doing. And to even suggest a comparison is absolutely absurd. He can't do that because he does call himself a socialist and then he has to make finer distinctions. Whatever. The question was ridiculous. Didn't further our understanding at all of Bernie Sanders' platform. They asked Cory Booker about, is he going to push his vegan diet on everyone? I'm paraphrasing here. Just ridiculously stupid question, but potentially a missed opportunity for Cory Booker, where he could have talked about animal welfare. He could have talked about the importance of diet. I mean, he could have been self-humanizing in some way, and it ended up just being a stupid question and kind of a non-answer. Now, one of the bigger narratives that I was paying attention to, which is a real narrative, unlike corporate media often foments totally bogus narratives nobody cares about. I think it was before the second debate, CNN was pushing, what will happen when Buttigieg and O'Rourke go against each other? It's like nothing, no one cares about that. They're each polling 2%. Totally fabricated narrative. There was a real question yesterday. There were really two primary questions for me. Number one, to what degree would Bernie and Warren, who are the two progressive frontrunners, Biden, of course, being more of a center-left frontrunner, would Bernie and Warren start to go against each other to any degree to try to distinguish themselves from each other, often just being lumped together as the two progressives? The other question was, would Bernie and Warren, either together or separately, start to go after Joe Biden now that he is sort of within striking range? And the answer was, Bernie went against Biden way harder than Warren. And I may just not be remembering, but I don't really remember Warren going after Biden at all, maybe once sort of lightly. But Bernie went after Biden on the Iraq war vote. Bernie went after Biden on health care. And some of those moments were arguably Bernie's best moments. Now, what did not go so well for Bernie, he unfortunately either had some kind of bronchitis or was just hoarse from so many events, but he had like a half lost voice. He didn't lose his voice, but particularly the first half of the debate, his voice was not strong. And by sheer, you could say it's chance, or if you're more conspiratorial, you could say it's because ABC wanted to help Elizabeth Warren. Very often, both Bernie and Warren would rebut what Joe Biden would say. But it would almost always be Elizabeth Warren who got the first opportunity. And as I've said before, even though they come from different political backgrounds, Bernie and Warren end up very similar on policy, and thus their rebuttals to Joe Biden were very, very similar. And merely by virtue of Elizabeth Warren getting the first rebuttal against Biden and Bernie Sanders getting the second rebuttal, which often contained 90% the same substance, and Bernie had half lost his voice, I think the optics were much stronger for Elizabeth Warren in terms of giving her perspective, even though, as I said, she didn't really attack Biden in the way that some thought maybe she would be doing. One thing that became very clear, and again, this is why we want more depth, and I would want way more with fewer candidates on stage. When you spend 40 minutes on one topic and you actually are put in a position where you have to go seventh and explain what is your policy, one dead giveaway that you don't really have a policy that's unique in any way is when the candidate would be asked, like the sixth person would say, okay, what is your position on what should happen with trade? And they just talk about how Trump is doing things that are bad and restate very general principles. On trade, this became very, very transparent. With a number of different candidates, there was no, Kamala Harris on trade had nothing unique or relevant to say. She criticized Trump. It's like, you're running against each other to go against Trump. You all disagree with Trump. I would limit the amount that you're attacking Trump at this point in the third debate, and had nothing particularly interesting to talk about with regard to trade. There were a lot of examples of this. A strong moment for Beto O'Rourke was when he was asked, are you going to just confiscate AK-47s and AR-15s, or what are you going to do? And it was sort of a right-wing framing of the gun question, but I respect Beto for saying, yes, we are. We are going to confiscate them. Other countries have done it. What's going on here is a disaster. We are going to confiscate some of those really deadly weapons. The pro-gun crowd is going to hate it either way. The pro-gun crowd is going to say that the entire debate was filled with people that want to grab guns, even if they don't say it. Even if you don't agree with the policy, I actually respect Beto for saying it. Andrew Yang had his best debate by far, and I got a lot of emails from Yang Gang people who felt that he didn't do so well. I think he actually did his best. Where he suffered is he's almost too polite, and he will stop short of his full speaking time rather than going over it. And this was one of the reasons why his speaking time was low. Also, they just don't go to him nearly as often. He made a joke at the beginning when talking about healthcare about, I'm Asian, so I know a lot of doctors, or something like that. And I actually do find it funny when he says stuff like that. When he says, I'm the opposite of Trump, I'm an Asian guy who likes math or whatever. I don't know if it actually endears him to people, or if it's just kind of a thing you hear a candidate say where it feels like they're trying to get attention. I'm sort of blind to it because I'm so sucked into this stuff. So I'd be curious what you think about that. On speaking time, Biden and Warren got the most, followed by Booker, then Bernie, Kamala Harris, Mayor Pete, Castro, Klobuchar, Beto, and Yang with the least speaking time, not surprisingly. Overall, I believe Elizabeth, I don't know who won it. It was less clear in this case. I think Elizabeth Warren did really well. I think Andrew Yang had his best debate so far. Julian Castro was very strong on a number of issues, including immigration and criminal justice reform. Senator Bernie Sanders was strong, said the right things, but again, was diminished with the hoarse voice and by virtue of having to go second after Warren in a lot of the rebuttals. But those are the four that I think did the best. Some people on Twitter yesterday were saying Kamala Harris crushed it. I don't know what debate you watched. I didn't see Kamala Harris crush anything. But in the end, I don't expect big polling moves other than maybe within the top three. And the reason why is Warren, Biden, and Bernie have substantive records on policy beyond everybody else on stage. They have pre-existing bases of support. They have sort of different visions generally about how they would govern. And they have constituencies that just don't really allow that much room for other candidates. So quite frankly, there's not that much support for the other candidates to gain because the top three now have solid bases of support. We will see how the polls change between now and the fourth debate, which will be, again, a two-night thing with 11 candidates, October 15th and 16th. I think it is a mistake to be adding more candidates. We should be culling them even more. But alas, that is not the case. Warren, Castro, Yang, Bernie, not in any particular order, the winners of last night's debate. Agree with me, disagree, let me know. I'm on Twitter at @dpacman.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new members of the day are Stephen O'Reilly and Charles McDonald. Charlie, I know Charlie. Charlie's a great guy. Stephen and Charlie, today's new members of the day. Appreciate both of you. You can join them at joinpakman.com. And someone who has been a longtime supporter, almost 5 years of membership, is Todd Hamlin. Todd Hamlin is today's longtime sustaining member of the day. I so appreciate everybody's support. You can join today at www.joinpakman.com. Coupon code available, not necessary, but available. This is 2020 will save you 40% off of the membership of your choice, be it a monthly or yearly membership. Let's go to the phones at 617-830-4750. A lot of people eager to get on today. Let's start with our caller from the 806 area code. Who's calling today from 806?
Hello, how's it going?
Good. Who's this?
My name's Lamar.
Hey, Lamont. What's up?
Hey, I just had a quick question. It's a little open-ended. As you know, there's a lot of Democratic candidates, in particular mine, which is Bernie Sanders, talking about increasing minimum wage.
Yes.
Now, I know that he and many others have been trying to do this since the 90s, et cetera. I wanted to know, even after he leaves, what we have is a major problem, systemic in my opinion, which is the cost of inflation or the rate of inflation continues to change. I know that there's different things like the Fair Labor Standard Act or different acts that were made. I just wanted to hear your thoughts on, do you believe that whoever the candidate is, whether Bernie or Elizabeth or whoever, should set up an agency or give more power to an agency that's independent of Congress to be able to naturally adjust the minimum wage without having to go through Congress where they gridlock a bunch of foolishness, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, so the answer is yes, the minimum wage should be indexed to inflation merely to keep up with inflation. The more complicated element of it is that cost of living is arguably more difficult to pin down than national inflation, and that because the minimum wage is very regionalized, what counts as a living wage in some parts of the country is not in other parts of the country. So there are some studies which suggest that you should actually tie the minimum wage to cost of living, which of course is very, very different in different parts of the country and even within states, and that's where we should be looking. And both politically and logistically, that's much more difficult. Now, let me say one other thing, Lamont. We actually have it pretty good in the United States as far as inflation. In my birth country of Argentina, the inflation is, I mean, it's been cartoonish for 15 years. It's crazy what's going on there. And in the US, fortunately, yes, there's a political obstacle to overcome in terms of getting the minimum wage indexed to inflation. But at least our inflation is very, very low compared to what's going on in countries like Argentina. And it's not nearly as big of a problem as it could be.
Thank you. I really appreciate your thoughts. Love your show. Keep up the great work.
All right. Thank you very much. Appreciate hearing from you, Lamont. Let's go next to our caller from the 917 area code. Who's calling today from 917?
Hello?
Yeah, that's you.
Hey, how you doing? This is Rob Israel.
Hey, what's going on?
I have a question in regard to, what are your thoughts on, I've been noticing a lot of supposed liberal people, or leftists that are pushing this anti-Russiagate thing, Jimmy Dore and all that. I was just curious what your thoughts on, do you find that incredibly damaging?
Are they even still doing it? I mean, listen, I don't watch any liberal shows, but I thought that they were done with that because we got the Mueller report already, didn't we?
Well, it's not even just, they're still pushing the whole maybe I'm not explaining it right, but just pushing that it's just a conspiracy and that it's a big failure. When I just find it really bizarre that anyone on the left or anyone that's just not a Trump supporter or any kind would totally ignore, which is probably the biggest scandal, I would say, in modern U.S. history. So
yeah, I mean, listen, I can't speak to what the motivations are for what other shows do. I don't really watch them, but at this point, I don't even know what. I guess people could say, oh, it was all overblown from the beginning or something like that. But it's listen, we got a report that was extremely damaging to the president. He has successfully kind of inoculated himself from consequences, and we'll see if re-election continues to keep him inoculated. But we had, convictions, indictments, prison time. Donald Trump found to have meet all 3 criteria for obstruction on, I think it's 8 of 14 possible obstructive acts. I don't know. I mean, listen, there's not any news related to it right now, so I'm not even talking about it. I don't know what it is that people are, I don't even know what there is to cover about it at this point, But again, I don't want to judge what other shows are doing if I haven't seen it.
Okay, I appreciate that. And if I could ask one other question, and I'm sure other people have probably asked this to you. I'm sure you might have heard or seen clips or watched. Did you see the Dave Rubin Tulsi interview?
I did. And, I've not covered it only because I've not had the emotional willpower to sit through it all to pull the clips. But it was basically a combination. I mean, it struck me as Dave Rubin doing exactly what the debate moderators have done so far, which is tee questions up with right-wing framings, and then Tulsi Gabbard answering them, buying into those right-wing framings rather than pointing out that the questions themselves are a huge part of the problem. It was really bad from what I saw.
Yeah, I'm just curious, where obviously she knows she's not going to get the nomination.
You would think so. I mean, only someone who is completely deluded would be polling 1% and not even in all of the debates anymore and believing that they're going to be the president or even the nominee. I assume you're right about that.
I just think that it's not even that. I think she's angling for something else, either some kind of spoil a third party run or who the hell knows, some bizarre Trump last minute thing, grabbing her, putting, so I just found that interview really disturbing.
Wait, now I've not heard this before. You're saying maybe she's angling to replace Mike Pence as Trump's running mate?
I think that might be a little bit extreme.
Yeah, I don't know that that's likely. I don't know that that's likely.
Happening in any way whatsoever.
Yeah.
But, there's always been little tells with Tulsi over the years, especially with her tweets of oh, we got to support Trump immediately after he announced being won. Little things like that. There have been little red herrings about her. I always notice too, anytime you mention something bad about her, the people that usually come out in full force on support her are not people on the left.
Yeah, I mean, my Hatred Mail episode this week was from a Tulsi supporter, which is crazy because usually it's just right-wing clowns that send the Hatred Mail. But all right, I appreciate the phone call. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
All right, take care. Let's go next to our caller from the 954 area code. Who's calling today from 954?
Hello?
Yeah, that's you.
Hey, David, how are you, man? Although I'm right-wing, I have watched your show for a couple of months now, and honestly just want to say I really appreciate you being as genuine as you can and, hopefully not too biased.
All right.
But my question is more on a personal note, David. I'm in college right now, and I've been thinking of, majoring in political science, but I'm kind of naive when it comes to the opportunities that may lead with that. Any information you may give me, or any route I can take with
here's my
science?
view. I think that college basically is primarily, for in a lot of different majors, it is to learn how to think, learn how to learn how to exist in environments that are different than just with family and friends, and starting to learn, behaving diplomatically and managing relationships and these types of things. And also, I wish that maybe things were different, but so much of what exists in terms of opportunities is not so much about like the subject matter that you memorize and learn in college, but about understanding that this is a world that depends on relationships and networking and who you know. So for me, if the idea is to major in political science and get an internship with an elected official and use that to maybe become an aide to there's a sort of a path there. But for me, mostly political science is like, listen, you could do poli-sci, you could do philosophy, you could do psychology, you could do sociology, you could do economics, or a lot of these are understanding how to think and learn. And a lot of the job opportunities will be very similar, no matter where you get a 4-year degree for, no matter which major you have for your 4-year degree. And it's mostly going to come down to, are you good at building relationships? Are you a go-getter in terms of getting internships and talking to people? So it's really like, if you're interested in it, do it. But you really need to think about what it is you want to be doing when you're out of college.
Wow. What a great answer, David. I appreciate it. And I also want to say quickly, I really enjoyed you having Sam Harris on the show. I'm a big fan of both of you, but have a great day, David.
All right. Thank you so much. A very, very polite right-winger, and that's a delightful, delightful thing to see. Okay, let's go next to our caller from the 862 area code. Who's calling today from 862?
Is that me?
That is you. Who's this?
Hello? Hi there. This is Sam from New Jersey.
Hey, Sam. What's going on?
I just had a quick question about your previous comments on like the whole discussion about private corporations, like the social media ones, and the whole Trump's his executive order thing. Right?
Yeah.
You defended that. So
wait, I defended Trump's executive order. What are you talking about?
No. That was a misphrase. Sorry, misspoke. The private companies, how they have the right to host what they want on websites.
Yes.
If I'm misrepresenting you, sorry, but I just wanted to kind of quickly remind you of what that
was.
Got it. So my question seemed contextual. So I had a question about how you feel about their targeted ads, like specifically Instagram and Facebook. I don't know if you've heard, but or experienced this yourself, but it almost seems like just having a discussion with people around your phone or your computer. You'll go on to Instagram or whatnot, and there will be targeted ads just about things that you were discussing. Say, yes. I want a new video game, right? Or something like that, or anything along those lines. And I go on Instagram, and within 5 minutes, I see an ad for something like that.
Yeah. This is not, so let me talk about this a little bit for people who,
sure.
I don't think that this is, my understanding is that this is not the platforms that are doing this. So basically I have a little bit of an understanding of this. I've tested this a number of times. So at one point I was thinking of getting a particular sneaker, and it's a sneaker. I'm not going to say the sneaker brand because they're not paying for ads and it just doesn't really matter. But sure. It's sort of an obscure sneaker brand. So it's not like I had been saying the name of it regularly. And I mentioned it to my girlfriend. And then the next day I got ads on Instagram for that sneaker company. And as a test, she said a different, I found an obscure sneaker brand and we talked about it. And she started getting ads for that sneaker brand the next day. Same thing happened with a Boston sports club that was opening where we mentioned it and I start getting ads for it. So this is happening, but my understanding is that this is not the social media platform that is, quote, doing this, that this is information that is available for advertisers to take advantage of when they want to advertise on different platforms. So I'm just not sure that it's accurate to say that that's something that Twitter is doing. I think this is a function of the way that you have your phone configured. I think it has something to do with Someone told me if you turn Bluetooth off, that won't happen, although that doesn't totally make sense to me. But yes, I know exactly what you're talking about.
Like a faux solution to that. But I don't see how those two things could be connected. But yeah, I guess my question about it would be, well, whether it's the social media companies or not, do you feel like, because they are hosting the ability to do that if it's not them directly doing it.
They're allowing you to target on that basis, for sure. Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah. Do you find that to be an intrusive thing, or do you think that that's allowed as something that a private corporation should be allowed to do?
Well, so again, we have to distinguish what it is that we are talking about. I find it intrusive and creepy. I find it intrusive and creepy on a personal level. Now, we are granting our phones the permissions required to do this. The strongest argument I've heard is we're granting it without even really knowing it, because who really understands all of those terms of service and the permissions that you're granting your phone?
Yeah, who even reads them?
Exactly. But I find it absolutely creepy and intrusive. And now there's a counter argument, which is, listen, if you're going to see 10 ads a day no matter what, isn't everyone better off if they are more targeted to your interests? But that seems to me sort of like a red herring.
Yeah. Okay. And I just had one more quick question, if that's all right.
Yeah.
So you have sort of, not, I wouldn't say flippantly, but because, you say you don't really do as much coverage for the people polling at 1%, but you've stated prior that, and in actually a previous call, Tulsi doesn't really have a chance of becoming the Democratic nominee. And I agree. I'm personally a Bernie supporter, so it's not like I'd be voting for her anyway.
Sure.
But in my humble opinion, I don't know if it's humble, but Bernie, Yang, and Tulsi are probably my top three, even though the latter two pretty much have no chance at this point. I kind of agree with your assessment, but I want to know what your opinion is on the fact that even though Tulsi, polled very low, she met the donation threshold and polled not well above, but enough on plenty of polls that would otherwise be considered legitimate if not for the DNC's random requirements that seem to be rather obscure. And I want to know what your opinion is on that. Like, should she have been allowed in the debate? Like, do you think that the polls that cited her as having polled above 2% should have been taken seriously? Listen,
my opinion, it's sort of like whatever I think about which polls should have been included, it wasn't a secret which polls counted, and it was known which polls were counting long before it was known who would meet the criteria in those particular polls. So I think the DNC does a lot of terrible stuff. They are gatekeepers in many ways that I find to be destructive. But the idea that after seeing that if certain polls were counted, Tulsi would be in, the DNC decided we're only going to count other ones. That's just not the way that it went. The polls that were counting were decided ahead of time. And it just, I have a hard time feeling outraged about it. I do.
I wouldn't say I'm outraged about it because I wasn't going to vote for her in the first place because, like I said, I'm more of a Bernie supporter.
Yeah.
I guess then you could back it up from there and say, do you think that practice of only picking specific polls, which certainly favor the DNC preferred candidates, because there's plenty of evidence that they over-select older voters, et cetera, and things like that.
Yeah, we've looked in detail at a lot of the polls, and most of them are not oversampling older voters. They are accounting for the fact that older voters are actually more likely to vote than younger voters, and I think that that's a completely legitimate thing to consider. But listen, I mean, the problem is if you have no standard, then anyone can just get a poll done. You can just purchase, anyone can fund a poll, and you can demand that it be done in a certain way. And then all of a sudden it's like, well, there needs to be some kind of line.
All right, fair enough. I understand that answer. Thank you very much, David. I appreciate you taking my question.
All right, thank you. Appreciate the phone call. Let's take a quick break. If you are on hold, don't hang up because we will go right back to the phones after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
Okay, let's get back to the phones at 617-830-4750. A lot of very high quality calls today. Let's see if we can keep it going with our caller from the 760 area code. Who's calling today from 760?
Hi, David. This is Amy from San Diego.
Hey, Amy, what's going on?
So kind of piggybacking off the last caller, he started making me think about Edward Snowden. And I'm also a Bernie supporter. And I'm wondering if you think Bernie would do anything that would allow Edward to come home. I actually don't know how you feel about him, but about Edward in particular. But yeah.
It's very hard to know. Would anyone have predicted when Donald Trump was running for president that he was going to get involved in whatever the person's name was that Kim Kardashian mentioned to him or whatever? Like, no, I mean, there was that was pretty unpredictable. So it's unpredictable it's hard to say what it is that
True.
Bernie would or wouldn't get involved in. But I've not seen, and correct me if I'm wrong if you know otherwise, I've not seen any evidence that Edward Snowden is high on Bernie's list of priorities.
Yeah, I don't think so either. I don't know. I guess for me personally, I've just gotten into like the mass surveillance and realizing how big it is in the country and all of that. And but yeah, you're right. I don't think Bernie, that's necessarily number one on Bernie's mind.
What would you like to see happen with Edward Snowden?
Well, mainly, for one, Snowden has said, like, he would come home if he got a fair trial. And so the reason he's not getting a fair trial is because he's tried with the Espionage Act. So, I mean, I don't want him to get tried with anything, but, I mean, I guess Bernie could lower or change whatever. I don't know. Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I don't think there is any path to Edward Snowden not being charged if he comes to the United States. I think that I've read some opinions that say Espionage Act is really, you're interpreting it pretty loosely if you apply it to Edward Snowden, and maybe it should not apply. I think that's a conversation to have, but I don't see any way that he comes back and just has no charges.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, no, you're right. I think that's reasonable. I think that makes sense.
All right, Amy, thank you for the call. Great to hear from you.
Thank you, David. Bye.
All right, take care. Let's go next to our caller from the 706 area code. 706, what's your name? Where are you calling from?
Oh, that must be me.
That is you.
All right. My name is Mike. I'm calling from Georgia.
What's going on, Mike?
All right. I have one question and maybe a second if I have time. Are you aware of this Bernie Sanders quote that came from I think it was a 2015 interview with NBC, where he was talking about how you don't need like 23 brands of deodorant or sneakers when there's children starving? Are you aware of that quote?
It rings a bell, but I honestly, if you had just given me the quote and said who said it, I don't know that I would say it was Bernie. So, I mean, I'm generally aware that I guess someone said that, but I don't know for sure who or if it's accurately attributed to Bernie.
Oh, it was Bernie. There was like an interview with, I believe it was NBC's Harwood, I think is his name.
Okay.
And I was just wondering, he's gotten a lot of flank for it. Bernie has in like libertarian circles. Do you think it's legitimate criticism, or do you think that there's something that's not being said?
I mean, so the crux of, for someone to say Americans don't need 23 types of deodorant when kids in Africa are starving is sort of like saying, you'd better clean your entire plate in Boston, Massachusetts, because there are kids in Africa starving, which is, I understand the sentiment, which is there are first world problems and then there are people living in abject poverty, and we should all act thoughtfully to the extent that we can and be activists for improving the world for as many people as possible. I get that. But from strictly speaking, it's sort of a fallacy in a sense. I mean, it's not how I would make the case for activism. Let me put it that way.
Okay. I can believe that makes sense. All right. Well, second question I had, about Bernie's free college plan.
Okay.
I'm a big supporter of Bernie, by the way. This is in no way a criticism of Bernie. I'm a huge Bernie supporter.
Okay.
I had a conversation with a libertarian friend of mine about Bernie's free college plan, and he was talking about how free college would control what gets taught in school. Do you know if that's true?
I cannot imagine how you strongly make that case. No. I mean, I'm sure that if you asked exactly how that would happen, I guess the idea would be if college is paid through taxation, then the government can tell the colleges what they need to teach. But it's like, I don't believe that that is what would happen. And there's the potential for that to already happen because there are so many schools that are already funded by state governments, if not federal. So it seems like an extremely weak argument against Bernie's plan. But you'd have to find out exactly how they imagine it would go down.
Okay, yeah, because I've been doing research and I've been really finding nothing to back that argument up. Like I've searched deep in the internet and I came up empty.
Yep. Well, I mean, I'm certainly not aware of how you would defend such an assertion.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's all I had. Thanks for taking my call.
Okay.
Big fan
Thank
of
you.
your show.
Appreciate the phone call. Great to hear from you. Let's go next to our caller from the 315 area code. Who's calling today from 315?
Hi, David. This is Josh. I see a lot of stats about climate change and automation, and I see that the worst effects of them happen to coincide around the same decades, around the 2040s and 2050s. And I'm wondering, do you think that liberal democracy or Western civilization or whatever you call it, how confident are you that these things are going to survive things like automation and climate change?
Well, I think there's a bigger question you're asking in general, which is it can feel for us right now in the middle of it like liberal democracy and the sort of type of geopolitical status quo that we have is just the way things are going to be indefinitely. And then as soon as you just zoom out a little bit, you see the impermanence of just about everything that has existed. And so my doubts about being able to say X or Y is going to survive beyond a particular point is that in general, we just have a huge bias towards believing that the way things are now are the way things are going to remain. It's very hard for us to imagine how things could be drastically different, but like Rome fell eventually. And if history has taught us anything to the extent that we know history, it's that even things that seem permanent are not. So as far as climate change specifically, there are a number of different theories and ideas about how quickly things are going to happen, automation, et cetera. The truth is, we're pretty damn bad as a species at predicting what is going to be going on beyond like 5 years, at least societally. Now, scientific predictions are different. Things move at a glacial pace, no pun intended. But even still, I think that what we're identifying now are trends, and the specificity that is sometimes attributed is maybe a little overzealous in terms of how good we are at predicting things, because there will be inflection points that continue to kind of like modify the trajectory. But I think with all of these questions, there are it's a serious open question as to whether humanity will survive as we know it beyond, relatively modest periods of time.
Well, I'm not worried so much about the survival of the human race, just the, I guess, all the progress we've made in the past, say, 200 years.
Yeah, it's completely reasonable to think that there could be a significant backslide. There's a lot of speculative fiction that has explored ways in which it would happen, where we would effectively, as you're saying, go back to the way things were 150 or 200 years ago. And I mean, I just don't know. The reason that these questions are hard for me is like, I can just speculate, but I just know that we're terrible at this stuff, at predicting this stuff. Like, I just don't know. I don't think we know.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Appreciate the phone call. Thank you so much. Let's go next to our caller from the 206 area code. Who's calling today from 206?
Hey, is that me?
Yeah, that's you. Who's this?
Hey, this is Brandon from Seattle. How you doing?
Good. And we're not on speakerphone or Bluetooth, are we, Brandon?
Oh, sorry about that. Let me.
Okay. Yeah,
is
let's
that any
see.
better?
I think it is.
Hello?
It is.
Gotcha.
So my question revolves around the recent firing of John Bolton, or resignment. Apparently we don't know.
Yeah.
So do you think that there will be an overall net positive change in relationships between the U.S. and Venezuela, the U.S. and Iran, because of somebody like John Bolton not being in Trump's administration anymore?
Yeah, I mentioned this in my commentary earlier this week. It's such an insane situation that we're in, because on the one hand, in general politics, John Bolton is one of the most disgusting chicken hawk neocon agitators who convinced George W. Bush about the Iraq War, who, the guy's just disgusting, truly. And it's like, what war is he not interested in? At the same time, he does have more empirical knowledge about what's going on geopolitically than Donald Trump. And so I'm sort of at a loss as to, it's so insane to even entertain the idea that we may be better off in terms of foreign policy with John Bolton involved than without. But when you consider that it's Bolton talking to Trump, I genuinely don't know if we're better off with him or without him if it's Trump left to his own devices as the alternative.
Gotcha. That's the assumption I've kind of come to at this point. The only problem I'm struggling with is the fact that, there are still people like, Mike Pompeo and Stephen Miller in Trump's administration. I don't think until you get those people out, there'll be definite change. I am, however, hopeful that, maybe, hey, Trump didn't agree with Bolton on Iran, and what's happening with talks with the Taliban, and hopefully, or maybe that's what spurred this whole firing. But I appreciate your perspective on it.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing, so like there are certain relationships where we could argue that we're certainly better off without Bolton. And there are others where maybe Bolton's involvement might have been a moderating influence on the even crazier ideas that that Donald Trump had. I just don't know. It's really hard to say. On balance, it's like we just need this entire administration out. We've got to start from scratch with a new cabinet. Like these people have all been disastrous.
Oh, I fully agree. These people need to be expunged from the American political system.
Exactly. All right, appreciate the call.
Right,
thank you.
I appreciate it, David.
Yep, take care. Bye-bye. All right, and that does it for calls. Sorry to everybody I didn't get to, but we did get to many. We will take calls again. We will take a quick break, and I will be back with plenty more right after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Okay, let's get to audience questions this week. This one came in from a few people, but I'm reading it as submitted by Ricky. Ricky says, hey, David, how likely is it that Trump will not accept the 2020 election results if he doesn't win? I hate to make this a semantic thing, but it really depends on what you mean by not accept. Do you mean will Trump just say the results were bogus, or do you mean will Trump actually activate any means he can to try to stay in the Oval Office despite the election results indicating that he has lost the election? Because Trump already has not accepted a whole bunch of stuff that he's wrong about, and it's had no material importance, right? What I mean by that is Trump didn't accept that Hurricane Dorian was not threatening Alabama. He used a Sharpie to draw a different weather map, but it doesn't matter that he didn't accept it. The hurricane didn't hit Alabama, and actual meteorologists knew that it wasn't going to. Trump doesn't accept that he didn't have a record-setting crowd at his inauguration back in January of 2017. But it doesn't really matter. Trump doesn't accept that he truly, just genuinely lost the popular vote in 2016 to Hillary Clinton. And he even actually tried to act on that by starting a voter integrity commission. But the commission found nothing and was disbanded, and that's that. So let's now go back to the question. Is it likely that Donald Trump is going to say that the 2020 election was unfair if he loses in 2020? I think there's an almost 100% certainty of that. And there's a few different ways that he might approach it. He might say it was voter fraud and really he won the election. He might sort of accept the results, but say that it was because he had the fake news media and who knows, foreign countries, whatever, working against him, or China, or whatever the case may be. Now, will he actually attempt to use force to retain the presidency between November 2020 and January of 2021, when the next president would be inaugurated? I doubt it. And if he does attempt it, he will not be allowed to stay in the end. So that is my sense of it. And I know that there are a lot. Interestingly, this is way more polarizing for our audience than I thought it would be, even among the left. I mean, I know the right is half bought in on the idea that the only way Trump could lose is if there is actually some kind of fraud. And I'm not talking to them. But even within the left, there are people who write to me and they say, no, David, you're not understanding this. Trump is going to do the things some people on the right said Obama was going to do. He will declare martial law in order to justify staying in the Oval Office, or he will try to suspend the 2020 election altogether, or whatever. I just don't see, there was no chance Barack Obama was going to do that stuff. And I don't see it as something that Donald Trump is going to do. I think the way that he will fight it is through a propaganda war. And that's honestly one of the big dangers of the fake news narrative that Donald Trump has fomented over the last couple of years. We've talked about how the fake news thing has successfully sort of caught on, in the sense that now any critical report about Donald Trump is very easy for Trumpists to just say, it's obviously fake. These are just people trying to take down Trump. It can't possibly be true. Fake news, fake news. That's one negative element of Donald Trump successfully running this fake news campaign. The other one, though, is that you may be priming these folks to actually accept these absolutely outrageous narratives in 2020, depending on what the election results are. But in the end, I don't see any way that Trump has even a 1% chance of actually successfully doing any of those things. And quite frankly, I think we need to be focused on winning the election and getting the vote out. And I know we've got to fight voter disenfranchisement and voter suppression and election fraud and foreign interference. I know we've got to do that. But if we get enough people to vote, then it's going to be much more powerful than anything that they can do. And that's where the focus should be, rather than the idea that Trump's going to suspend the 2020 election. He will say he didn't lose fair and square. But the margin of victory should be and could be so big that in the end, it should not really end up making a difference. Next question is about Andrew Yang. Hey, David, when will Andrew Yang enter the top 3 Democratic primary candidates in the polling? So I'm going to assume that this is a serious question, because the person who sent it has been emailing me about Andrew Yang in a perfectly reasonable and serious manner for a year. And they genuinely seem to be fans and supporters of Andrew Yang. I'm not going to assume it's a trolling question, but here's the deal. Andrew Yang is not going to enter the top 3 in 2020 Democratic polling. And that's okay. All right. He's done way more than many people expected. He has introduced some interesting ideas into the 2020 Democratic primary discussion. Now, I know a lot of people will say, David, stop it. Andrew has said his goal is not poll 3%. His goal is to be president of the United States. That's great. That should be everyone's goal who's running for president. I wish everybody was genuinely running because they believe that they are going to be president of the United States. I have no problem with Andrew Yang personally. I like him. I've interviewed him multiple times. I see him as sincere. I see him as genuine. I don't see him as some kind of right libertarian Trojan horse, as some people have pointed out. He has policy ideas. Some are better than others. There are problems with some of his policy ideas, and that's all as we would expect with any candidate. But he's not going to poll in the top 3. And it's not because I don't believe in him, okay? Andrew Yang was in 6th place heading into the 3rd debate last night, behind Biden, Bernie, Warren, Harris, and Buttigieg. It is already a huge accomplishment that he's ahead of all sorts of actual elected officials and political insiders. He's ahead of Beto and Cory Booker and Tulsi Gabbard and numerous other members of Congress and more establishment people who had higher name recognition at the beginning of this campaign. Now, maybe I'll be eating my hat next week if new post-debate polling shows Andrew Yang in 3rd place. But between Biden and Bernie and Warren, that's roughly 2/3 of the Democratic primary electorate already. If you look at their second choices, I don't see a mathematical path for Andrew Yang to break the top 3. Even if everyone other than Biden, Bernie, and Warren drops out, and Andrew Yang gets a full 50% of all of that support, of all those other people, that's 11 points. It's still not enough to break into third place. And that's not even accounting for the reality that the support of some of those other candidates would go to Bernie, Biden, and Warren, making it even more difficult for Andrew Yang to catch up. So he's not going to enter the top three in this election. That doesn't mean he can't have an impact. It doesn't mean he's a bad person. It doesn't mean he's running a bad campaign. He has ideas, some of which are good and some of which are less good, like any candidate. And that's all great. But if people are genuinely waiting for the day in which we say Andrew Yang has pulled into second place, I don't see it happening. If you disagree with me, give me the mathematical path that Andrew Yang has, not just he's going to just crush it between now and election day and the first primaries, and he'll be in second or third place before you know it. I just don't see it. Convince me that I'm wrong. Hey, David, what would a gun control compromise look like between left and right? Okay, let's do this, but we have to agree on a parameter first, because otherwise we're not going to get anywhere. Given that the Second Amendment exists, what would a compromise look like? If we are really going to imagine a compromise that ignores that the Second Amendment exists, even if you don't like the Second Amendment, even if you wish the Second Amendment didn't exist, we won't get anywhere in imagining a compromise that assumes the Second Amendment doesn't exist. So we actually have to account for that when we think about what a gun safety compromise might look like between left and right. But I actually think there's a bigger problem that we have to talk about. We could rattle off policies. I could say, well, the right could concede universal background checks, and maybe we would ban some high-capacity magazines, and the left would have to concede something else. Then we would just argue about whether that's too far left or too far right or too extreme. We would get nowhere in reality, though, because there's a bigger issue when you talk about a gun safety compromise. The problem here is not a practical problem. We could get together and workshop ideas and come to some kind of hypothetical compromise where both sides would give some stuff up and get something, and everybody would be sort of unhappy, which is often the way a good compromise ends up. The problem is we can't actually have that conversation in good faith because, number one, everyone will see the compromise as a Trojan horse and then immediately imagine that the other side is going to just try to get more and use the compromise as a way to move the needle slightly. And number two, you have very well-funded market-altering players like the NRA that are a direct impediment to actually having good faith conversations about this stuff. So it's actually a completely intractable conversation. The causes of gun violence need to be addressed. The availability of guns needs to be addressed. Mental health, sure, needs to be addressed. Gun culture, the religion of guns, is a massive problem in the United States. And for good reason. No one trusts the other side to negotiate in good faith. I'm not doing both sides-ism, okay? The pro-gun, more guns in more places side is disgusting, and they are extremely well-funded by these gun manufacturers through groups like the NRA. But whatever list you and I can come up with right now about what a compromise would look like is effectively dead on arrival, because groups like the NRA are very good at getting even Donald Trump to say, oh, I was for background checks. Yeah, we're not doing that anymore. And number two, if you concede anything, the other side will say that's not in good faith. You're just doing this in order to, in 6 months, push for more, and we're not going to allow it. And this is unfortunately one of the areas in which I am most pessimistic. Gun safety. I've talked already about climate change. If you've been watching the show, you know that I am not particularly optimistic on the climate. Gun safety is another area where I am not at all optimistic that we are going to make it happen. And a huge reason for that is the just corrosive and disgusting effect of organizations like the NRA. And I want to be convinced that this could happen. I really do. But look at what happened with background checks after Sandy Hook. Look at all of the other examples. So I am not particularly optimistic. And I think whatever list we could come up with would be taking an immediate backseat to the partisan and moneyed lobbying interests that exist within gun safety. Let me know if I'm wrong and I should have some more optimism on this. We've got a great bonus show coming up for you today. Become a member or a patron to get instant access at joinpacman.com or patreon.com/David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.